The air was dead still as I pulled my rig, a beat-up old RV named Wanderer, into the tiny clearing near the edge of the forest. It was a spot I'd stumbled upon last summer. Pure luck, really. See, my name's Ethan Hayes, and I was beyond fried from the city's soul, sucking grind and the endless drone of traffic and sirens. These woods. This was my escape hatch, my sanity saver. Every now and then, I'd bolt out here to clear my head and remind myself why I kept pushing through the daily BS. Setting up camp was muscle memory by now. Awning out, chairs positioned, fire pit ready to go. This forest was thick. The kind of place where you'd get swallowed whole if you wandered 10 feet without a compass. Towering pines shot up all around, their branches weaving together into a thick canopy that turned the late afternoon sun into a dim, greenish twilight. Only sounds were the chirps and calls of birds somewhere far off, and the rustle of little critters scurrying through the underbrush. I got to work gathering firewood, the rhythmic thwack of my hatchet echoing through the stillness. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, spooky shadows, that familiar calm washed over me. No cell service out here, and honestly, that was the whole point. Just me, Mother Nature, and a few days of blessed peace. But this time, something felt off. Couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a nagging feeling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress I was trying to ditch. I headed back to the Wanderer and lit the fire, watching the flames lick at the wood as I cracked open a cold one. Later that night, I was cooking some grub over the fire, sausages and beans. The camper's special, when I heard a scream. It was faint, almost lost in the rustling of the leaves, but it was definitely a scream. I froze, every muscle tense, listening. Another scream, this one closer. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Hello, is someone there?" I yelled, my voice sounding pathetically small and shaky. The forest just answered with silence. I grabbed my flashlight, a B-51 that could light up a football field, and took a few hesitant steps into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness like a lightsaber. Just as I was about to turn back, thinking I was being paranoid, a figure stumbled into the light. It was a young woman, her clothes ripped and covered in dirt, blood trickling down her forehead. "Help me, please," she gasped, collapsing at my feet. I knelt beside her, my mind racing. What happened? Who did this to you?" She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide and wild with terror. "He's coming!" "We have to hide." Without another word, I helped her up and practically dragged her back to the Wanderer, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. I gave her a bottle of water and tried to get her to calm down. "Who's coming? What's going on?" She took a shaky gulp of water, trying to steady her breathing. "My name is Chloe. My boyfriend Mark and I were hiking a few miles from here. This man, he attacked us. I got away, but I don't know what happened to Mark." As she spoke, I saw the raw panic in her eyes. This wasn't some random mugging. This felt a planned, deliberate. I reached for my phone, but just as I thought, no signal. "We need to get out of here," I said, already firing up the Wanderer's engine. But before I could even put it in gear, the headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A tall guy, built like a brick shithouse, in dirty jeans and a flannel shirt. He just stood there watching us. His face was hidden by a hood, but I could feel his eyes on us, like a predator sizing up its prey. A chill snaked down my spine. "Lock the doors," I whispered to Chloe, my eyes glued to the guy. She scrambled to do it, her hands shaking like crazy. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there like he was daring us to make a run for it. I revved the engine, inching the RV forward. He took a step back, but he didn't leave. Then, suddenly, he pulled something from his pocket. It was a huge hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the headlights. He started towards us, and I floored it. The wanderer lurched forward, the tires spitting gravel. The guy dove to the side, barely avoiding getting flattened. "Hang on," I shouted as the RV bounced and swayed over the rough terrain. I was gunning for the main road, praying we'd reach it before this psycho caught up to us. In the rearview mirror, I saw him running after us, that damn knife catching the moonlight. Chloe was sobbing beside me, clutching the seatbelt like it was a lifeline. "What the hell is happening?" I muttered to myself, wrestling with the steering wheel as we hurtled down the twisting forest path. We finally hit the main road, and I didn't let up on the gas. The lights of a nearby town were visible in the distance, a beacon of hope. But as we got closer, a loud bang ripped through the air. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no," I cursed, trying to restart it, but it was no use. I grabbed my flashlight and a tire iron from under the seat. "Stay here, lock the doors. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you drive into town and get help." Chloe nodded, her face pale but determined. I stepped out into the night, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The road was empty, the silence heavy and suffocating. I checked under the wanderer, finding a slashed fuel line. He must have done it while we were back in the woods. A rustling sound behind me made me spin around, tire iron raised. The man emerged from the trees, that damn knife glinting in the moonlight. He smiled, a twisted, sick grin that made my blood run cold. "Thought you could get away, did you?" he taunted, his voice low and menacing. I swung the tire iron, but he was fast, dodging it and slashing at me with the knife. Pain exploded in my arm as the blade sliced through my flesh. I stumbled back, clutching my wound, but I wasn't going down without a fight. He lunged again, and I managed to block it with the tire iron, using it to knock the knife out of his hand. He roared in anger and tackled me to the ground. We wrestled, a tangle of limbs, each of us fighting for the upper hand. He was strong, way stronger than me, but I fought like a cornered animal. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. The man stiffened, a look of shock spreading across his face. He slumped to the side, revealing Chloe standing behind him, a thick, broken branch in her hands. She'd saved my life. We didn't stick around to see if he was dead. Together, we somehow managed to push the wanderer into town, where we finally found help. The cops arrived, and we led them back to the spot. The guy was gone, vanished, but his knife was still there, a grim reminder of the night's terror. We later found out he was some wanted criminal, responsible for a whole string of attacks in the area. Mark's body was found a few days later, a tragic end to a nightmare. Chloe and I went our separate ways after that night. But that shared experience, it bonded us in a way nobody else could understand. And yeah, I still love the solitude of the forest, but I'm a hell of a lot more cautious now, always aware that there's darkness out there, lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting for its chance to strike. It's funny how you can crave simplicity, you know. The quiet of the woods, the way the trees sway like they're doing a slow dance, the crunch of leaves under your boots, and air so clean it almost hurts. That's what I needed. An escape hatch from the city's noise, the constant grind, the never-ending to-do lists. My RV, the Wanderer, was my ticket to peace. A few days in the woods and I'd be good as new. Little did I know, this trip would be anything but peaceful. My name's Finnegan, Finn Riley, and yeah, it's a bit of an old-fashioned name. Blame my folks. They were big on family history. We're talking generations of farmers, calloused hands and dirt under the fingernails. I took a different path, engineering, all numbers and logic, but that love for the outdoors, it's in my blood. Every few months, I ditch the city and head for the hills, literally. This time, I had my sights set on a tucked, away spot in the Catskills. A buddy of mine, Mark, told me about this killer lake up there, Crystal Lake. He said it was pristine, totally off the radar, none of that touristy nonsense. Music to my ears. The drive was a beast, the kind that makes your butt numb and your eyes blurry. But the scenery was killer, all winding roads and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. By the time I rolled into my chosen spot near the lake, I was beat but stoked. Towering pines, birds chirping their evening tunes, it was perfect. I set up the Wanderer, cracked open a cold one, and settled in with a book. The silence was like a warm blanket, a million miles away from the city's constant hum. I was in my happy place. Man, was I wrong about that being just a calm before the storm. Next morning, I was itching to explore. I packed a daypack, water, some trail mix, a map, the usual, and a flashlight, just in case. The woods were thick, and the trails were more like suggestions than actual paths. But that's part of the fun, right? I followed this narrow trail that snaked deeper into the woods, the sunlight filtering through the leaves like a green spotlight. About an hour in, I stumbled upon this old, beat-up cabin. It looked like it hadn't seen a soul in decades, vines all over it, roof half caved in. Naturally, I had to check it out. I mean, who wouldn't? I pushed the door open, creak, like something out of a horror movie, and stepped inside. Dusty, musty, with old junk scattered everywhere, furniture falling apart, rusty tools, newspapers yellowed with age. It was like stepping back in time. I was about to head back when I saw this weird symbol carved into one of the beams. It was intricate, like some kind of ancient symbol, but I had no clue what it meant. As I was leaving, I heard a rustling outside. My heart did a little jump. I peeked out the door, all cautious. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Time to head back to the Wanderer, I thought. That solitude I was digging earlier. Now it felt kinda creepy, like I was being watched. And that feeling just wouldn't quit. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, had me jumping out of my skin. I picked up the pace, practically jogging back to the RV. When I finally saw the wanderer through the trees, it was like seeing an old friend. I practically leaped for joy. That night, sleep was a no-go. That weird symbol and the feeling of being watched kept replaying in my head like a broken record. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A laugh. Low, menacing, and definitely not the sound of a happy camper. My heart was in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight, shone it out the window, but saw zip. The laughter continued, coming from the direction of the lake. I debated, should I go and look for the source or stay put like a scaredy cat? I went out. The moment I stepped outside, the laughter stopped. Dead silence. Creepy, right? I started walking towards the lake, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. When I got to the shore, I saw him. A guy, standing by the water, his back to me. I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, he just turned around, real slow. His face was twisted, angry, his eyes like a cornered animal. He was dressed in rags and was holding this long, rusty knife. My blood turned to ice. Before I could even react, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, barely dodging the blade. I swung the flashlight, connected with his arm, and he dropped the knife. I didn't stick around to see what he'd do next. I booked it, my heart hammering in my chest like a drum solo. I could hear him chasing me, getting closer. I ran faster, legs burning, lungs screaming. Just as I reached the wanderer, I felt this searing pain in my back. I yelled out and fell hard. He was on me in a flash, hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I fought like hell, clawing at his face, kicking, trying anything. Then, out of nowhere, banj. A gunshot. The guy went limp, his grip loosening. I shoved him off and scrambled up, looking around like a madman. There, at the edge of the clearing, was another guy, holding a rifle. He looked like he'd lived in the woods his whole life, rugged, with eyes that had seen things. "You okay?" he asked, lowering the rifle. I just nodded, still gasping for air. He checked the guy on the ground. "He's dead," he said, like he was stating the obvious. What the hell happened here? I told him everything, the cabin, the symbol, the laughter, the whole crazy story. He listened, nodding along, his face serious. "Name's Jasper," he said, holding out his hand. "Been tracking this guy for weeks. He's been terrorizing folks around here. Lucky I showed up when I did." I shook his hand, grateful but still totally freaked out. "Thanks," I managed to say. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. We called the cops, and Jasper stayed with me until they arrived." He told them his side of the story. The police took our statements, hauled the body away, and promised they'd look into it. As the sun started to come up, the forest seemed to calm down a bit. Birds started singing again, and the rustling leaves didn't sound so scary anymore. Jasper and I talked a little more before he took off, promising to keep in touch. I spent the rest of the day packing up the Wanderer, itching to get the hell out of there. As I drove away from the Catskills, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that psycho standing there. But all I saw were trees and the winding road behind me. That trip was supposed to be my chill out time, my nature fix. Instead, it turned into a freaking nightmare. But as I headed back to the city, I felt this weird sense of relief. I made it out alive, thanks to a stranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The whole thing shook me up, no doubt, but it didn't break me. I knew I'd head back to the woods again someday. But for now, I was happy to be heading back to the concrete jungle, where the only wild things are the taxi drivers. At least, that's what I thought back then. It all started when I decided to ditch the city craziness for a quiet weekend of RV camping in the middle of nowhere, also known as the serene woods of northern Michigan. The hustle and bustle had been eating me alive, so I packed up my old clunker of an RV, a relic from the late 80s, I swear, and headed out into the wilderness. Little did I know, this trip was going to test every last nerve I had. My name's Jake Collins. I'm not exactly a hermit, but I do love my peace and quiet. Grew up in a tiny town where your closest neighbor was a good mile away. Quiet was always my comfort zone, you know. A reminder of simpler times. But on this trip, that quiet was gonna turn dark and, frankly, pretty messed up. First night, I parked the RV at this sweet little spot by Lake Superior. The water stretched out forever, and the sky was clear as a bell, with stars scattered like someone spilled glitter all over the place. Perfect setup for some much-needed chilling out, right? I built a little campfire, roasted some marshmallows, and just let the peace and quiet soak in. By day 2, I was almost feeling too comfortable. Spent the morning fishing, caught a couple of decent-sized trout that I figured I'd grill up for dinner. The lake was seriously quiet, just the water lapping at the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves. Felt like I had the whole world to myself, and for a minute there, I was happy. Around lunchtime, I decided to go for a hike deeper into the woods. I brought my camera, hoping to snap some pics of the local wildlife. The forest was thick with these huge pine trees, and so much underbrush you could easily get lost if you weren't paying attention. I marked my path with bits of bright orange tape, just in case. About an hour in, I stumbled on this old, beat-up cabin. Looked like it had been abandoned for years. Roof was sagging, windows were all boarded up. Naturally, I was curious, so I went closer. That's when I noticed something weird. A faint smell of smoke, like someone had just used the fireplace. Inside, the cabin was a total disaster. Broken furniture, old newspapers, and empty food cans everywhere. But what really caught my eye was a map pinned to the wall, with all these red circles on it. Seemed to show different spots in the forest, some of them way out in the boonies. I took a picture of the map, thinking it might be cool to check out later. As I turned to leave, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just the wind, I told myself, trying to shake off the creepy feeling that was creeping up on me. I got out of there fast, practically running back to the RV. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I grilled up the trout and tried to enjoy my dinner, but my mind kept going back to that cabin and the weird map. Who made it? And why? I couldn't relax. As it got dark, I locked all the doors and windows of the RV, something I hadn't even bothered to do the night before. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of the RV. My heart was racing as I grabbed my flashlight and peeked out the window. Nothing. Just the dark, spooky night. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just an animal. But as I was trying to get back to sleep, the banging started again, louder this time. I grabbed the baseball bat I always keep handy and threw open the door, shining the flashlight out into the night. Standing there, just outside the beam of light, was a guy. He was tall and scrawny, with messy hair and this wild look in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at me. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaky but trying to sound tough. He took a step closer, and I gripped the bat tighter. "Get out of here," I yelled. Without warning, he lunged at me, and I swung the bat as hard as I could. It connected with a sickening thud, and the guy crumpled to the ground. I was panting. I kicked his body to make sure he was out cold. Then I dragged him inside the RV. I tied him up with some rope I had and sat down, trying to catch my breath. Who was this guy? And what did he want with me? My mind was racing, coming up with all sorts of crazy scenarios, none of them good. I decided to wait till morning to figure out what to do. I barely slept that night, constantly checking on the guy to make sure he hadn't woken up. As the sun started to come up, the guy started to stir, groaning. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around all confused before his eyes landed on me. "Who are you?" I asked again. He didn't answer, just stared at me with that same crazy look. Frustrated, I got up and searched his pockets. Nothing but a crumpled piece of paper with the same map I'd seen in the cabin. "What do you have this?" I asked, holding the map in front of his face. He finally spoke, his voice raspy and strained. "You shouldn't have come here." "Why? What's going on?" He shook his head, a weird smile creeping across his face. "They'll come for you too, just like they came for the others." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, the others?" But he wouldn't say anything else, just kept that creepy smile on his face. I knew I couldn't keep him tied up forever, so I decided to take him to the nearest town and hand him over to the cops. Maybe they could make sense of this mess. As I drove down the winding forest roads, the guy sat silently in the passenger seat, his eyes never leaving me. We were about an hour away from town when he suddenly lunged for the steering wheel, making the RV swerve like crazy. I fought him off, trying to keep us on the road, but we ended up crashing into a tree. The impact jolted us both. I scrambled out of the RV, dazed but determined to get away. The guy was already on his feet, coming after me with that crazed look in his eyes. I ran into the woods, hoping to lose him in the thick underbrush, but he was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps pounding after me. I tripped over a root and fell hard. Before I could get up, he was on me, his hands around my throat. I struggled, gasping for air, but his grip was like iron. Just when I thought it was over, a loud gunshot rang out, and the guy slumped over dead. I looked up to see a group of guys coming out of the trees, rifles in hand. They were wearing hunting gear and looked serious as hell. "You all right?" one of them asked, helping me up. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Thank you." I don't know what he wanted, but he attacked me. The men exchanged glances. "We've been tracking him for days," another one said. "He's part of a group that's been terrorizing campers around here. You're lucky we found you." I shuddered, thinking about what could have happened. "What do we do now?" "We'll take care of him," the first guy said, nodding towards the body. "You should get to town and tell the cops about this. They need to know what's going on out here." I thanked them again and made my way back to the RV, my hands still shaking. The drive to town was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I understood, that the guy's warning wasn't just the ramblings of a madman. When I finally got to town and told the cops what happened, they seemed concerned but not exactly surprised. They said they'd heard similar stories before and were trying to get to the bottom of it. I gave them all the info I had, including the map, and they promised to investigate. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. The forest, which had always been my escape, now felt like it was full of hidden dangers. I decided then and there that my camping days were over. Some things, I realized, are better left unexplored. My name's Jake Collins, and I've always been a nature guy. City life, especially growing up in the concrete jungle of LA, just wasn't my speed. I craved quiet, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat. That's how I found myself in the thick woods of Northern California, miles from anything resembling civilization. My beat up Old Winnebago, which I affectionately call the Wanderer, was my home away from home. I'm a pro at finding those off, the grid spots, where the only sounds are the wind whispering secrets to the pine trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. This time, I found a sweet little clearing by a stream so clear you could count the pebbles on the bottom. It was perfect. I had enough grub water, a first aid kit, and my trusty rifle to last me a few days. You gotta be prepared, even though I didn't really expect any trouble. The first day was pretty chill. I hiked, fished, and just soaked up the peace. As the sun dipped below the trees, painting long shadows through the forest, I sat by the campfire, feeling like the luckiest guy in the world. I had my little slice of heaven, or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling. Not the gentle breeze from yesterday. This was different. I brushed it off, figuring it was just a deer or something. I went about my usual routine: coffee, breakfast, a little reading. By the time the sun was high, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I grabbed a small backpack, tossed in some water, snacks, a map, and my knife. Left the rifle behind, figured I wouldn't need it for a short hike. The trail I picked was barely there, more like a deer track winding through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only soul on earth. After about an hour, I stumbled upon something that sent a chill down my spine: a campsite. But this wasn't just any campsite. It looked like whoever was here left in a hurry. Tent overturned, stuff scattered everywhere, half burnt fire still smoldering. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the unsettling silence. No answer. Just that creepy quiet that puts you on edge. I poked around the site. Clothes, a wallet, a backpack, all just lying there. Then I found a journal. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible. It talked about being watched, strange noises at night, and the last entry just said, "They're coming." A shiver went down my spine. I wanted out of there, back to the Wanderer, back to somewhere that didn't feel so wrong. But my damn curiosity got the better of me. I decided to look around a little more, maybe find a clue or something. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, almost human. My heart was pounding like a drum. I slowly turned, scanning the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. Just the trees and the underbrush, silent as the grave. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw him. A guy, skinny and disheveled, standing a few yards away, hidden in the shadows. His eyes were wild, like a cornered animal's. I called out, trying to sound calm. "You okay?" He didn't say a word, just stared at me. I took a step closer, and he took off, disappearing into the forest like a ghost. I hesitated for a second, then decided to follow him. Maybe he knew what happened here. Maybe he needed help. I chased him through the woods, branches and bushes whipping at me. He was fast, but I kept him in sight. We burst into another clearing, and that's when I saw it, another wrecked campsite. This one was even worse. There were bloodstains on the ground, and the air smelled like copper, like fear. The man was gone, vanished. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Then, bam, a searing pain exploded in the back of my head, and everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was tied to a tree, my hands bound with rough rope. The guy was standing over me, that crazy look still in his eyes. He was mumbling to himself something about protecting the forest and keeping outsiders away. When he saw I was awake, he crouched down, his face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice raspy. "This place isn't for you." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling, even though I tried to keep it steady. He ignored me, just stared with those wild eyes. Then he stood up and walked over to a makeshift altar I hadn't noticed before. It was covered in symbols and what looked like animal bones. He picked up a knife, the blade glinting in the sunlight. I yanked at the ropes, but they were too tight. Panic set in as he started walking toward me, the knife held high. He was chanting now, words I couldn't understand. Just as he reached me, there was a loud crack, like a gunshot. He crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him. I looked up and saw another man, older, with a grizzled beard, holding a rifle. He approached cautiously, keeping his eyes on the man on the ground. He nudged him with his boot, making sure he was dead, then turned to me. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. "I think so," I stammered, still in shock. He cut me loose, and I stumbled to my feet. "Who was he?" The old man shook his head. "Don't rightly know. Found him out here a few weeks back, rambling about protecting the forest. Tried to help him, but he was too far gone." We walked back to my Winnebago in silence. I was grateful for the company, even if I didn't know this guy from Adam. Back at the Wanderer, he introduced himself as Sam, a local who patrolled the woods to keep an eye out for trouble. He said there had been reports of missing campers lately, but nothing solid until now. As we sat by the campfire, Sam told me about the history of the area, how it was once sacred land for the native tribes, a place of peace. But over the years, it had been taken over by settlers, loggers, and now, campers like me. He believed the guy we encountered had somehow connected with the old spirits of the forest, driven mad by their whispers. I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. As the fire died down, Sam offered to stay the night, just in case. I gratefully accepted, not wanting to be alone after all that. The next morning, I packed up and left, eager to put the whole nightmare behind me. Sam promised to report the incident to the authorities, and I knew I'd have to give a statement. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest, wondering what other secrets it held. The drive back to the city was long and quiet, giving me plenty of time to think. I decided to take a break from camping for a while, maybe find a new hobby that didn't involve risking my life. Years later, I still think about that weekend sometimes, especially when I feel that old itch for the wilderness. But I've learned to be more cautious, to respect the places I visit and the histories they hold. And though I'll never forget the terror of that night, I also remember the kindness of a stranger who saved my life. I guess, in the end, it's a reminder that there's good and bad everywhere, and it's up to us to navigate that balance as best we can. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a quiet forest the same way again. Those whispering woods hold more than just peace and quiet, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. The peace and quiet of my RV trip in the backwoods of Montana was everything I hoped for at first. Miles from anywhere, it was just me, the towering pines, and the whisper of the wind. My name's Ben Miller, and I came out here to get away from it all. Not running from anything, really, just the usual city BS, the crowds, you know. I love the outdoors. It's where I find my chill. Those first few hours, pure bliss. I got my camp set up, made some coffee, started a little fire for later. The air was crisp and clean, way better than the smog I was used to. As the sun started to dip below the trees, casting these long, spooky shadows, I figured, why not take a walk? There's something about the woods at dusk, you know. The way the light changes, it just calls to me. It was on this walk that things started to get weird. The silence was total. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but my own boots crunching on the leaves. I tried to brush it off. Just a quiet night, right? But I couldn't shake this feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around. But there was nothing there. Just the trees and the fading light. I decided to head back to the RV. Maybe I was just being paranoid. As I got close to my campsite, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a figure standing next to my RV, barely visible in the dim light. My heart was pounding. What the? It was a guy, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like old, worn-out clothes. He hadn't been there when I left. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. What are you doing here? The guy didn't move, didn't respond. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't right. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn and run. But I forced myself to take a step closer. "I asked you a question," I said, my voice firmer now. Still nothing. I was close enough now to see him better. His clothes were tattered, dirty, and he had this wild look about him, like he'd been living out here for a long time. My mind was racing. Who was this guy? A lost hiker? A fugitive? I didn't want to find out. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on him. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward and falling hard. He was on me in a second, a knife glinting in the faint light. I kicked and scrambled, managing to knock the knife away. We wrestled on the ground, each trying to get the upper hand. I could smell him now, this full mix of sweat and decay. He was strong, terrifyingly strong, and I knew I had to get away, or he'd kill me. Somehow I managed to break free, landing a solid kick to his ribs that bought me a few seconds. I bolted for the RV, my heart hammering, adrenaline pumping. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my rifle from the storage compartment. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely load it. I could hear him outside, circling the RV, trying the doors and windows. He was relentless, pounding on the walls, shouting gibberish. I felt trapped. My safe space had turned into a cage. I knew I couldn't stay in there forever. He would eventually break in or set the RV on fire, and then I'd be toast. I had to do something. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and unlocked the door, bursting out with the rifle raised. He was right there, but the sight of the gun gave him pause. "Back off," I yelled, my voice shaking with fear and anger. "I don't want to shoot you, but I will if I have to." He sneered, his eyes wild and crazed. "You think you can scare me with that?" He spat. "You don't have the guts." I didn't wait for him to make a move. I fired a warning shot into the ground near his feet. The loud crack echoed through the forest, startling him for a second. He hesitated, and that's all I needed. I charged at him, using the butt of the rifle to knock him down. We struggled again, but this time I had the advantage. I got him on the ground and put the barrel to his head. "Stay down," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Stay down, or I swear I'll pull the trigger." He froze, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both breathing hard. Then, slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. I kept the gun on him as I reached for my phone to call the cops. It felt like forever before they finally got there. They took him away, and I gave my statement, still shaking from the whole thing. Turns out, he was a wanted man, a real bad guy who'd been living off the grid for years, hiding out in the wilderness. They found evidence of other campsites, other people he'd attacked, other people who hadn't been as lucky as me. As the police car drove away, taking him with them, I finally let myself breathe. The campsite was trashed. My RV had a few dents and scratches, but I was alive. I knew I'd never forget the terror of that night, the sheer fight for survival. But I also knew that I'd faced my fears and come out on top. I spent the rest of the night in my RV, not daring to close my eyes. The forest, once a place of peace, had become a reminder of how quickly things can go south. Dawn finally broke, painting the sky in these crazy colors, a total contrast to the events of the night. I packed up my stuff, ready to get out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest stood silent and unchanging, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. The peace and quiet I'd come for gone. Forever gone. I decided to take a break from city life. I never imagined it would lead me to this. I'd always been a bit of an adventurous soul, but after a particularly grueling project at work, I needed some serious downtime. So, I packed up my RV and headed out to the rugged terrains of Utah, hoping to find some peace and quiet among the canyons and deserts. My name's Ben Collins. I've seen my fair share of hard times. Grew up in a rough neighborhood, worked my way through college, and carved out a decent career for myself. But stress has a way of creeping up on you, no matter how tough you think you are. That's why this trip was supposed to be my sanctuary, a chance to recharge, away from the chaos of daily life. The campsite I chose was about as remote as you could get without falling off the map entirely. A small, tucked away corner of Escalante, known more for its stunning rock formations and solitude than for human activity. It was perfect, or so I thought. I arrived just before noon, the sun high and relentless in the clear blue sky. The landscape was a breathtaking array of reds and oranges, with towering sandstone cliffs and deep, winding canyons that seemed to stretch forever. I parked the RV in a small clearing, the only signs of civilization being a narrow dirt road that led back to the highway and a rusty old sign warning travelers about the rugged terrain. After setting up camp, I decided to explore a bit. There was a narrow path leading into one of the nearby canyons that looked intriguing. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water, snacks, and my trusty map and set off. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind or distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, though in a way that the city could never be. The canyon was even more impressive up close. The walls soared high above, creating a cool, shaded pathway that felt like a secret world hidden away from the rest of the earth. I wandered for hours, completely losing track of time, captivated by the natural beauty and the sense of isolation. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself deeper in the canyon than I had planned. The light began to fade, and with it, the temperature dropped. I decided it was time to head back, but that's when I realized I wasn't entirely sure which way back was. The twists and turns of the canyon had disoriented me, and my map wasn't much help without clear landmarks. Trying not to panic, I retraced my steps as best I could. Every corner looked the same, every rock and bush blending into the next. I cursed under my breath, frustration mounting. Just as I was beginning to seriously worry, I saw it, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, or maybe an animal. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, a person, moving quickly through the shadows up ahead. Relief washed over me. Maybe they could help me find my way back. I called out, picking up my pace to catch up. Hey, wait up. The figure stopped and turned, and I saw him for the first time. He was a tall man, rugged and weary, dressed in worn-out clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. His face was gaunt, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. There was something unsettling about him, but I pushed the thought aside. Right now, I needed directions more than I needed to worry about making friends. "Can you help me?" I asked, a bit breathless as I reached him. "I'm lost, trying to get back to the main campsite." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and started walking, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated but decided to trust him. What choice did I have? We walked in silence, the canyon walls seeming to close in around us as the light continued to fade. The man's pace was brisk, almost hurried, and I had to struggle to keep up. Something about his demeanor set me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a wider section of the canyon, where the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground. The man stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and for the first time, I noticed the knife at his belt. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough and low. "Ben," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for helping me out. I really appreciate it." He nodded slowly, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Ben. Dangerous place." I swallowed hard, the unease growing stronger. "Yeah, I guess I didn't think it through. Just needed some time away, you know." He took a step closer, and I instinctively took a step back. "Time away from what?" "Work, life, everything," I said, forcing a smile. Figured the middle of nowhere was a good place to clear my head. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Middle of nowhere is where people disappear, Ben. Nobody hears them scream out here." My heart pounded in my chest. "Look, I really should get back to my RV. It's getting late." He shook his head, his smile widening. "You're not going anywhere, Ben. Not tonight." Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife flashing in the dying light. I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward and falling hard against the rocky ground. Pain shot through my arm, but adrenaline kicked in, and I scrambled to my feet, instinctively reaching for a rock to defend myself. "Stay away from me," I shouted, brandishing the rock like a makeshift weapon. The man laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "You're not getting out of here alive, Ben. Nobody does." He lunged again, and this time I wasn't quick enough. The knife slashed across my arm, a searing pain that brought tears to my eyes. But I fought back, swinging the rock with all my might and connecting with his head. He staggered, dazed, and I took the opportunity to run. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding, blood dripping from my arm. The narrow canyon walls seemed to close in around me, and I felt like I was being swallowed by the earth itself. I could hear his footsteps behind me, relentless, and the sound of his laughter growing louder. I turned a corner and saw a small crevice in the rock, just big enough for me to squeeze through. Without thinking, I dove into it, wedging myself into the narrow space and praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. "Ben," he called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. "You can't hide forever." I held my breath, the pain in my arm throbbing in time with my heartbeat. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally I heard his footsteps retreat. I waited longer still, until the canyon was silent once more. When I was sure he was gone, I crawled out of the crevice, my body atching, my mind racing. I had to get back to the RV, had to get help. I stumbled through the canyon, every shadow making me jump, every sound sending a spike of fear through me. But I kept going, driven by sheer willpower and the desperate need to survive. It was nearly dawn by the time I finally saw it, the glint of metal in the early light, the shape of my RV parked in the clearing. I staggered towards it, my vision blurring, my strength nearly gone. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine and floored it, the RV lurching forward with a roar as I sped down the dirt road, leaving the canyon and the nightmare behind. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me go. His face was twisted in a snarl of rage, but he didn't follow. He just watched, his eyes burning with hatred. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I finally called the police. They found the canyon and the crevice I had hidden in, but the man was gone, vanished without a trace. They took my statement, and I gave them all the details I could remember, but it felt like a blur, a twisted, surreal nightmare that I could barely believe had happened. But it had. The scars on my arm were proof enough, and the memory of his cold, piercing eyes would haunt me forever. Life went on, as it always does. I went back to work, tried to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But there were nights when I couldn't sleep, when the silence felt too much like the canyon, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I didn't go camping again, not for a long time, and when I did, it was never alone. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Part of me still can't believe it happened, but it did, and I'll never forget that man's face, or the sound of his laughter echoing through the canyon. That place will forever be a canyon of no return. It all started out simple enough. Just another camping trip in my trusty old RV. I parked it in this super remote spot in the heart of the Black Hills in South Dakota. A buddy of mine, Dave, told me about it. He swore by how isolated and naturally beautiful it was. I was stoked for some peace and quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Well, let me tell you, I got way more than I bargained for. So, let me back up a bit. My name's Mark, and I've always been a bit of an outdoorsy guy. Thanks to my old man. He dragged me on countless fishing trips and hikes when I was a kid. We didn't always see eye to eye, but that love for the outdoors, that stuck with me. That's why whenever I get the chance, I take my RV and hit the road. This time I was looking for a real escape. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me, my thoughts, and maybe a few deer to keep me company. I pulled into this small clearing by a creek, just enough space for the RV. The sun was setting, casting these long, eerie shadows through the trees. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for what I thought would be a chill evening. After dinner, I figured I'd stretch my legs with a little walk. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down this narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods. The air was cool, and the sounds of the forest at night were both eerie and calming, I walked for maybe an hour, just letting my mind wander. That's when I noticed something weird. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the chirping insects, they'd all gone silent. Dead silent. I stopped, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but nope, it was real. A figure, standing just at the edge of the beam, tall, gaunt, with this crazy look in his eyes. He didn't move, just stared at me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I took a step back. "Hey man, you lost or something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. He just kept staring. Something about the way he looked, all disheveled and wild, sent a chill down my spine. I decided it was time to head back to the RV, like, right now. So I turned around and started walking, quickening my pace. The trail seemed way longer in the dark, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to be right behind me. When I finally made it back to the RV, I locked the door and checked all the windows. I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself he was just some drifter who'd wandered too far. But deep down I knew something was off. I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside made me jump. Around midnight I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it towards the sound, and there he was, the same wild-eyed guy, his face pressed against the glass, grinning like a freaking madman. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy wrench, and shouted, "Get the hell away from here." He didn't flinch, just kept grinning. I backed away, my mind racing. The phone was useless out here. No signal for miles. I was on my own. I had to think. The RV had a small compartment with a shotgun I kept for emergencies, but it was locked, and the keys were in my backpack, somewhere in the dark. The tapping continued, more insistent now. I couldn't just sit there and wait. I had to do something. I took a deep breath, clutched the wrench tighter, and made a dash for the compartment. In the dim light, I fumbled with the lock, cursing under my breath. Finally, I got it open and pulled out the shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. I turned back towards the window, but he was gone. The silence was deafening. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for him to reappear. Minutes felt like hours. Then, a crash from the rear of the RV. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the noise. The rear window was smashed, glass scattered everywhere. I moved slowly, flashlight in one hand, shotgun in the other. The sense of dread was overwhelming. Then I saw him, crawling through the broken window. His hands and face were covered in cuts, blood smearing the walls. He looked up at me, eyes wild with madness. I didn't hesitate. I fired. The blast echoed inside the RV, and he dropped to the floor, motionless. I stood there, breathing heavily, the reality of what just happened sinking in. I had to make sure. I approached slowly, the flashlight beam revealing the extent of the damage. He was dead, no doubt about it. The immediate threat was over. But now I had a bigger problem. What the hell was I supposed to do next? There was no way I could move the body on my own, and with no cell service, I couldn't call for help. I decided to stay put until morning, barricading the door and keeping the shotgun close. Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside made me jump. As dawn broke, I ventured outside, still clutching the shotgun. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing. but still harboring the memory of the night's events. I needed to find a way to report this, to get help. I decided to hike to the nearest ranger station, about 10 miles away, leaving the RV and its grisly contents behind. The hike was grueling. Every step was weighed down by the previous night's horror. When I finally reached the station, I must have looked like a madman myself. The ranger on duty, a middle-aged guy named Officer Reynolds, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, every detail, and he didn't doubt me for a second. We drove back to the RV in his truck, Officer Reynolds calling for backup on the way. When we arrived, the scene was just as I had left it. Reynolds' expression grew grimmer as he surveyed the damage. He radioed in for more officers and a medical team. It took hours for them to process everything, taking my statement multiple times. They identified the man as someone who had been missing for months, a local named Caleb, with a history of mental illness. Apparently his mental state had deteriorated to the point of violence. They assured me I had done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. By late afternoon, the area was cleared, and they let me go. I packed up my things, ready to leave this nightmare behind. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that wild-eyed face staring back at me. But it was just me and the open road ahead. And that's how my simple camping trip turned into a day I'll never, ever forget. My name's Wyatt, but my buddies call me Wyatt, Trouble Magnet. Dobbins, yeah, it's a self-proclaimed title, but trust me, I've earned it. I figured a quiet weekend roughing it by the Suwannee River down in Florida would be a good way to recharge. Just me, my beat-up RV, and my old pal, Big Ben. Now, Ben's a mountain of a man. Think lumberjack meets gentle giant. We go way back to high school, terrorizing the local fishing holes and swapping stories under the stars. He just got himself a fancy new RV, practically a palace on wheels, and was itching to try it out. So, naturally I was in. We found a sweet spot tucked away amongst these ancient-looking cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. Gave the whole place a spooky, kind of magical vibe. First day, pure bliss. We cast our lines, fired up the grill, and swapped stories that probably got taller with each telling. As the sun went down, the air filled up with this symphony of crickets, and the occasional hoot from some old philosopher. We were miles from nowhere, and it was perfect. Later that night, bellies full of steak and a decent buzz from some good bourbon Ben brought. We were just chilling by the campfire, enjoying the silence. Then we heard it, this faint muffled scream. Kinda like someone was in trouble but far off. You hear that? Ben asked, his eyes wide in the firelight. Yeah, I said, my senses on high alert. Didn't sound good. Then it came again, louder this time. Definitely a woman's scream, and definitely coming from somewhere deep in those woods. We didn't even hesitate. Grabbed our flashlights and took off into the darkness. The undergrowth thick, and the sounds of the night seemed to swallow us whole. The screams were getting more desperate with every step. Finally, we burst into this clearing, and there it was, a creepy, run-down cabin that looked straight out of a horror flick. The front door was hanging open, but the screaming had stopped. Now it was just this dead silence that was even more unsettling. Ben and I exchanged a look. We knew we had to go in. Inside, the place was trashed, like someone had turned it upside down looking for something. And the smell, oh man, it was like something had crawled in there to die a long, slow death. And then, in the corner, we saw her. This young woman, tied up and gagged, her eyes wide with pure terror. I rushed over and started working on the ropes while Ben kept watch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "They're still out there. We gotta go." "Who?" I asked, but before she could answer, we heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on leaves outside. Ben's eyes met mine, and he just mouthed one word: "Run." We hauled that poor girl out the back door, just as two guys burst in the front. We didn't stop running until we were back at the RV, a safe distance away from that nightmare cabin. Ben threw that thing into gear, and we tore out of there like bats out of hell. The woman, her name was Sarah, told us she'd been out hiking when these two guys snatched her. She had no idea why. All she knew was they weren't planning on letting her go. Ever. As we drove, I kept getting this feeling we were being followed, like those creeps were hot on our tail. Ben was glued to the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We decided the best thing to do was get to the nearest town and call the cops. We rolled into this sleepy little place called Live Oak just as the sun was coming up and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Hayes, a guy who looked like he'd been chewing on nails since birth, listened to our story with this look on his face like we were a couple of escaped lunatics. "So, let me get this straight," he drawled, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You two yahoos expect me to believe you just stumbled upon a kidnapping out in the middle of godforsaken nowhere?" "Eats the truth, Sheriff," Sarah pleaded. "Those men are dangerous." Dahay sighed, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and finally agreed to send a deputy out to check on the cabin. In the meantime, he told us to lay low at the local motel. We weren't thrilled, but what else could we do? That night, me and Ben were trying to decompress in our dingy motel room. Sarah was next door, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were responsible for her now. Ben poured us a couple more fingers of bourbon, and we tried to relax. But it was no use. The whole day had been too crazy. Then, just when we thought things couldn't get any weirder, there was a knock at the door. Ben opened it, and bam! This guy lunges at him, and they start wrestling around like a couple of bears. I jump up to help, but then another guy comes out of nowhere and cracks me over the head with something hard. Lights out. When I came to, I was tied to a chair in some dark, musty room. Ben was next to me out cold and Sarah was gone, and standing over us, the two goons from the cabin, looking like they were about to have some fun. Well, the taller, skinnier one sneered. "Looks like we got ourselves a couple of heroes." His buddy, a shorter, stockier guy who looked like he enjoyed inflicting pain, just grinned. "What do you want?" I growled, trying to sound braver than I felt. Skinny just laughed. "We want you to mind your own damn business. But you just had to play the hero, didn't you? Now you're gonna pay." He pulled out this nasty looking knife and started walking towards Ben, who was starting to come around. I struggled against the ropes, but they were cinched tight. All I could do was watch in horror as Skinny raised the knife. But then, out of nowhere, the door flew open, and there was Sheriff Hayes, his gun drawn, looking like the wrath of God. "Drop the knife," he bellowed. The two goons froze. For a split second, I thought we were home free. But then Shorty grabbed Sarah, who must have been hiding somewhere in the room, and held a gun to her head. "Stay back, old man, or I swear I'll do it." Hayes hesitated. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I saw the terror in Sarah's eyes, and I knew we had to do something. Then Ben, bless his heart, did something crazy. He threw his whole weight backward, tipping his chair over and slamming into Skinny. The knife went flying, and I managed to kick it away. In the chaos that followed, Hayes fired his gun, hitting Shorty in the leg. He went down, letting go of Sarah, who scrambled out of the way. Skinny tried to make a run for it, but Hayes tackled him to the ground, slapping the cuffs on him with practiced ease. It was all over in seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Backup arrived, and the whole place was crawling with cops. Me and Ben got untied, and Sarah was whisked off to the hospital to get checked out. As we stood outside the motel, watching the sun come up, Hayes walked over. "You boys did all right," he admitted, his voice still gruff, but a little softer around the edges. "Turns out those scumbags are part of a human trafficking ring we've been after for months. Thanks to you, we finally got enough to shut 'em down." Ben and I just looked at each other, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over us. It wasn't exactly the relaxing weekend we'd planned, but at least Sarah was safe, and those creeps were going to be locked up for a long, long time. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline finally start to fade. Ben clapped me on the shoulder, and we both knew this was a story we'd be telling for the rest of our lives. As the cops hauled the bad guys away, I couldn't help but think about how 1 minute you're sipping bourbon by a campfire, and the next you're in a life or death showdown. It's a crazy world out there, but hey, sometimes the good guys actually win. And man, let me tell you, it's one hell of a story. My name's Mark Jenkins, and I've always been a sucker for the great outdoors. So, when I finally got the chance to go RV camping in the Smoky Mountains, I jumped at it. I'd been going through a rough patch lately, dealing with some personal stuff, some losses, and I needed a break from the daily grind. This trip was supposed to be my way of reconnecting with nature, finding some peace and quiet, you know. I drove my RV to this remote spot, deep in the Smokies. It was perfect, far from the touristy areas, nestled among these towering trees with a clear, babbling brook nearby. As I set up camp, I felt this rare sense of calm wash over me. The air was fresh, and the sounds of wildlife were like a soothing symphony. After settling in, I decided to take a short hike before dinner. The trail wasn't marked, but I've got a decent sense of direction and a GPS, so I wasn't worried. As I walked, the forest seemed to embrace me. The canopy filtered the late afternoon sun into these dappled patterns on the forest floor. Then I came across this old, overgrown path that piqued my curiosity, and I decided to follow it. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. It was dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it had this eerie charm. I walked around it, noticing signs of long, abandoned activity, rusty tools, broken furniture, and scattered remnants of what must have been someone's home long ago. A chill ran through me, and I felt this inexplicable urge to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted. I peered through one of the broken windows and saw something odd, a stack of old, yellowing photographs on a rickety table. The faces were faded, but they showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their expressions were solemn, almost haunting. I felt a pang of sadness and quickly turned away, deciding it was time to head back to my RV. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I chalked it up to my imagination, spurred by the eerie atmosphere of that abandoned cabin. The sun was setting, and the forest grew darker and more foreboding. I quickened my pace. Back at the RV, I started a fire and cooked dinner. The feeling of unease hadn't left me, but the fire's warmth and the simple act of preparing a meal helped to calm my nerves. I ate quickly, cleaned up, and settled in for the night, hoping a good sleep would clear my head, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by images of the family in those photographs. Around midnight, I heard a faint rustling outside. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening intently. Then I heard footsteps, crunching on the gravel around the RV. They were slow and deliberate, circling the vehicle. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. The light caught a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with an unkempt beard and wild eyes. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze intense and unnerving. I stepped back into the RV and locked the door, my mind racing. Was he a drifter? A local who didn't like strangers? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, barely dozing off. At dawn, I decided to pack up and leave. This trip wasn't worth the anxiety. As I loaded my gear into the RV, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt near the fire pit was a single word: Elivov. I didn't need any more encouragement. I finished packing in record time and hit the road, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. The drive back to civilization was a blur, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Who was that man? Why was he there? And what did he want? A few hours later, I pulled into a gas station to refuel and collect my thoughts. I went inside, bought a coffee, and struck up a conversation with the cashier, an older woman named Betty. I casually mentioned the abandoned cabin, hoping to get some local insight. Betty's face paled when I described the location. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said quietly. "That place has a bad history." She went on to explain that the cabin had once belonged to the Hargrove family, who mysteriously vanished about 50 years ago. No trace of them was ever found, and the cabin had been abandoned ever since. Locals avoided the area, believing it to be cursed. Cursed, I scoffed, trying to mask my unease with skepticism. Betty nodded solemnly. People have reported strange sightings, unexplained noises, and feeling watched. Some say the spirits of the Hargroves never left. I left the gas station feeling more unsettled than ever. Cursed or not, I was done with this place. I drove straight home, determined to put the whole experience behind me. For a while, things returned to normal: work, friends, the usual routine. But the memory of that night never fully faded. Sometimes in the dead of night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the man's wild eyes haunting my dreams. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. About a month later, I received a call from an old college buddy, Ethan. He was planning a camping trip and wanted me to join. I hesitated, but Ethan was persuasive, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. So, I agreed, hoping this trip would help me shake off the lingering dread. We headed to a different part of the Smokies, far from that cursed cabin. The first night was great: campfire stories, laughter, and a few too many beers. It felt good to be out in nature again, this time with company. On the second day, we decided to go for a hike. Ethan, ever the adventurer, suggested we explore an old, unmarked trail he'd heard about. My heart sank, but I didn't want to ruin the fun, so I reluctantly agreed. As we walked, the forest felt increasingly oppressive, the trees closing in around us. The path grew narrower and more overgrown, and my anxiety spiked. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of danger, my mind flashing back to that abandoned cabin. After a couple of hours, we stumbled upon another old cabin. This one was in better shape, but it still gave off an unsettling vibe. Ethan, ever the explorer, insisted we check it out. I followed, my heart in my throat. Inside, it was clear someone had been living there recently. There were fresh food supplies, a makeshift bed, and a stack of newspapers. The headlines made my blood run cold. They were all about missing persons in the area. Each article detailed a hiker who had vanished without a trace. "Ethan, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Ethan was too engrossed in the discovery to listen. He picked up one of the newspapers, his face pale. "Mark, look at this," he said, showing me an article with a photo. It was a picture of the man I'd seen that night near my RV. "Let's go." "Now," I urged, panic rising in my chest. Ethan finally nodded, and we hurried out of the cabin, back onto the trail. The forest seemed even more oppressive, the shadows darker and more menacing. We made it back to our campsite just as the sun was setting. I could feel eyes on us the whole time, but we didn't stop or look back. Once we were back at camp, we packed up in record time. Ethan was as spooked as I was now, and neither of us wanted to spend another night out here. We drove through the night, the atmosphere in the car tense and silent. When we finally reached civilization, we pulled into a diner, desperate for some normalcy. Over greasy burgers and coffee, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "That guy in the photo," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "He's been missing for years. How did you see him last month?" I had no answers. None of it made sense. We sat there in silence, the weight of our experiences hanging over us like a dark cloud. Eventually, we parted ways, both of us eager to get back to our respective lives, and put this nightmare behind us. But I knew I'd never forget the forest, the cabin, the man with wild eyes. They were etched into my memory. I'd always loved the outdoors, but now every rustle in the woods, every unexplained noise brought back that primal fear. Life went on, but the world felt a little darker, a little more dangerous. I kept my distance from the wilderness, sticking to well-trodden paths and populated campsites. The Smokies had shown me a side of nature I'd never known, a side that was wild, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. Years later, I still think about those hikes, the abandoned cabins, and the missing people. I wonder what really happened to the Hargroves and the countless others who vanished without a trace. The world is full of mysteries, some best left unsolved. And sometimes I wonder if there are still places out there, hidden in the shadows of our world, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Places where the lost and forgotten linger, waiting for someone to find them, or to become one of them. You know those days when you just gotta get away from it all. That's how I ended up deep in the Catco Mountains, parked next to this crazy beautiful lake with my trusty old RV Betsy. There's nothing like the smell of pine trees and the sound of a distant stream to make you forget the world exists. I've always been a city boy, but these little trips into the wilderness keep me sane. My name's Ben Miles, by the way. I'm not one for big crowds or flashy places. Give me a good book, a fishing rod, and some peace and quiet, and I'm happy. Betsy's my escape pod, a 1983 Winnebago that's seen better days but still runs like a champ. I'd been planning this trip for months, meticulously mapping out the best spots to camp, fish, and just chill. This particular spot, tucked away from the main road and far from any other campers, was perfect. I got there early in the morning, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. The lake was like a sheet of glass, reflecting the sky perfectly. I parked Betsy, set up my fishing gear, and settled into a folding chair with a steaming mug of coffee. The silence was golden, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of a bird. After a couple of hours of fishing, and with a decent catch of trout, I decided to explore a bit. There was an old hiking trail that looked like it went around the lake and into the woods. I grabbed my backpack, threw in some snacks, water, and my trusty pocket knife and set off. The trail was overgrown, but I managed to follow it without too much trouble. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something weird, an old, abandoned cabin. It was hidden by the thick underbrush and tall pines, almost like the forest was trying to swallow it whole. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The cabin was a wreck, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door creaked like something out of a horror movie when I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty, with a faint smell of something rotting. I could see remnants of someone's life scattered around: rusty tools, broken furniture, and old newspapers dating back to the 1970s. As I was poking around, I found a trapdoor in the floor, partially covered by a moth-eaten rug. I hesitated for a second, then thought, what the heck, and decided to see where it led. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed down into the darkness. The basement was surprisingly large and dry, with shelves lining the walls, filled with jars of preserved food and other supplies. It looked like whoever had lived here had been prepping for the end of the world or something. At the far end of the room, I saw a small wooden box. Inside, there were a few old photographs and a handwritten journal. The journal belonged to a guy named Elias Thorne, who had lived here with his family. His entries talked about this fear that was eating him up, something he only called the shadow. His last entry was chilling. "They're coming. I know it. I can feel it in my bones. God help us all." I felt a shiver run down my spine. What had he been so afraid of? And what had happened to him and his family? I decided I'd had enough of that creepy cabin and made my way back up the ladder. As I stepped out of the cabin, I noticed the sun was starting to set. I needed to get back to Betsy before it got too dark. The hike back was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. When I finally reached the RV, I felt a wave of relief. I locked the door behind me and made a quick dinner, trying to push that eerie cabin out of my mind. Night fell, and with it came an unsettling silence. I was used to the sounds of the city, but this kind of quiet was different. It felt heavy, oppressive. I climbed into bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and my pocket knife and quietly made my way to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of men, dressed in dark clothing, were standing around Betsy. They were armed with rifles and looked like they meant business. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I confront them? Hide? Try to call for help? I decided to stay put and watch. For now. They seemed to be searching for something, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their intent was clear. They were looking for me. One of them broke away from the group and started walking towards the RV. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't notice me through the window. He walked right past Betsy and headed towards the lake. The others followed, leaving me alone for the moment. I took the chance and grabbed my cell phone, dialing 911, but there was no signal. Of course, I was too far out in the boonies. I had to think fast. I couldn't stay in the RV. It was too obvious a hiding spot. I quietly gathered a few essentials: water, food, my knife, and the flashlight, and slipped out the back door. I crept into the forest, moving as quietly as a mouse. I knew I had to put some distance between me and those guys. I followed the same trail I'd taken earlier, hoping to find another hiding spot. The moon provided just enough light to see by, but the forest was still dark and disorienting. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, had my nerves on edge. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon another clearing. This one had an old shed, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I slipped inside and found a spot to hide behind some old crates. As I huddled in the darkness, I heard them again, footsteps, coming closer. They were methodically searching the area, calling out to each other in low voices. My heart was pounding like a drum as I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible. I heard one of them approach the shed. He pushed open the door and shined his flashlight inside. The beam swept across the room, missing me by inches. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. "Nothing here," he called out to the others. He left the shed and continued his search. I let out a silent sigh of relief, but I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet. I waited for what felt like an eternity before daring to move. When I was sure they were gone, I carefully made my way out of the shed and back into the forest. I needed to find a way to signal for help. As I moved through the trees, I remembered the flare gun I had packed in my backpack. I pulled it out and fired it into the sky, hoping someone would see it and come to my rescue. The flare lit up the night, casting an eerie red glow over the forest. I heard the men shouting in the distance, their voices angry and frantic. They had seen the flare, and they were coming for me. I had to keep moving. I ran through the forest, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to stay ahead of them. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely able to see in the darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw a light up ahead. It was faint, but it was a beacon of hope. I pushed myself to keep going, praying it was someone who could help. As I got closer, I realized it was a small ranger station. I banged on the door, shouting for help. A groggy-looking ranger opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. "Help me," I gasped. "There are men out there, and they're trying to kill me." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and led me inside, locking the door behind us. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men outside didn't stand a chance. The Rangers apprehended them without much of a fight. It turned out they were part of some militia group that had been causing trouble in the area for months. They had seen my RV and figured I was an easy target. As the Rangers led them away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe, thanks to a lucky flare and a helpful ranger. I knew I would never forget this day, but I also knew I wouldn't let it stop me from enjoying the peace and solitude of the wilderness. After giving my statement to the authorities, I returned to Betsy, exhausted but grateful. The morning sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the lake. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the water, watching the day begin. It had been a terrifying experience, but I wasn't going to let it ruin my love for the great outdoors. I just had to be a bit more careful next time. And maybe, just maybe, I'd bring a friend along for the ride. The gentle hum of my RV's engine was oddly soothing as I navigated the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains. I hadn't been on a solo trip like this in years. I suppose I needed the escape, a break from the monotony of daily life. It was just me, my thoughts, and the open road. My name's Ethan Hayes, and I've seen my fair share of trouble, but nothing quite like what I was about to encounter. The plan was simple: drive deep into the woods, set up camp by one of the remote lakes, and enjoy some peace and quiet. Maybe do a bit of fishing. The further I got from civilization, the lighter I felt. My life back in Pittsburgh had become a blur of deadlines and corporate jargon, something I never imagined for myself growing up in a small town in Tennessee. I needed this, I told myself. A few days off the grid would do wonders. I reached the campsite by early afternoon. It was perfect for a clearing by the lake, surrounded by dense forest. I parked the RV, set up my chair by the water, and cracked open a cold beer. The sun was warm on my face, the sound of birds, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore were all I needed. As I sat there, I noticed something odd. There were no other campers around. This spot was supposed to be popular, especially this time of year. I shrugged it off, enjoying the solitude, but as the hours passed, an uneasy feeling started creeping in. It was too quiet. The first night was uneventful, though I kept waking up, convinced I heard something moving outside. Each time, I'd grab my flashlight and look out the window, but there was nothing. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just wildlife. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, snacks, a map, and my old hunting knife. The trails around the lake were overgrown, as if no one had used them in years. I pushed through the underbrush, enjoying the adventure. After about an hour, I came across something peculiar, an old, rusted car. It was completely out of place, deep in the woods. The windows were smashed, and nature had started reclaiming it. It gave me the creeps, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside the car, I found a couple of empty beer cans, a torn map, and a photograph. It was of a young couple, smiling at the camera, clearly enjoying their camping trip. The back of the photo was dated from 1998. It felt like a relic from another time. I took the photo and headed back to my RV, feeling a bit unsettled. That night, things took a darker turn. I was cooking dinner when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned off the stove and listened. The steps stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, there was a knock on the door. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Just another knock, louder this time. I grabbed my hunting knife and approached the door cautiously. "I'm armed," I warned. "State your business." Silence. I opened the door a crack, knife at the ready. There was no one there, just the dark forest and the faint sound of the wind. I stepped outside, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. I shouted. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I took a step forward, and that's when it bolted into the woods. Without thinking, I chased after it, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran, the underbrush scratching at my legs. I lost sight of the figure, but I kept running, driven by a mix of fear and adrenaline. I don't know how long I ran before I realized I was completely lost. The trees loomed over me, and the path was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I was about to give up when I heard voices, faint but unmistakable. I followed the sound, hoping it was other campers. Instead, I stumbled into a clearing where a group of men were standing around a campfire. They looked up as I approached, their faces hidden in shadow. "What are you doing out here?" one of them asked, his voice gruff and unfriendly. I got lost, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I was camping by the lake, and... You shouldn't be here, another man interrupted. He stepped forward, and I saw the glint of a knife in his hand. I backed away slowly. I don't want any trouble. I'll just go back to my RV. The first man shook his head. I'm afraid it's too late for that. Before I could react, they grabbed me, forcing me to the ground. I struggled, but there were too many of them. They tied my hands behind my back and dragged me to the fire. I could see now that they were all armed, their faces marked with cruel intent. What do you want? I demanded, my voice breaking. The leader of the group, a guy I'll call Red, knelt beside me, his eyes cold and calculating. You're in our territory, he said. We don't take kindly to trespassers, Dom. This is a public campsite, I protested. I didn't know. Doesn't matter. Red cut me off. You saw too much. They kept me there for what felt like hours, questioning me about why I was there, what I had seen, who knew I was camping. I told them the truth, hoping they'd let me go, but it became clear they had no intention of doing that. As the night wore on, the men started arguing amongst themselves. A guy named Mitch seemed to be the most aggressive, wanting to get rid of me right then. Another, who they called Silas, seemed a bit more hesitant. I seized the opportunity to inch closer to the fire, my hands still bound. If I could just grab a burning stick, maybe I could fight my way out. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from the woods, like a gunshot. The men froze, their attention diverted. In the confusion, I managed to grab a burning branch and swing it wildly, hitting one of them in the face. He screamed and fell back, giving me just enough time to break into a run. With my hands still tied, I stumbled through the forest, the sounds of pursuit close behind. I ran until my lungs burned, the adrenaline pushing me forward. I could hear them shouting, but I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran before I tripped and fell, rolling down a steep embankment. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I lay there, struggling to catch my breath, I realized I was back at the old car I had found earlier. I scrambled inside, trying to hide. My heart pounded as I listened to the men searching for me, their voices getting closer. I prayed they wouldn't find me, that they'd give up and go away. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually the voices faded. I waited until I was sure they were gone before crawling out of the car. I was battered and bruised, but alive. I made my way back to my RV, half expecting the men to be waiting for me. To my relief, the campsite was empty. I quickly packed up my things and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could imagine. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally stopped to catch my breath. I looked at the photograph I had taken from the car, wondering what had happened to the couple. Had they encountered the same men? Had they met a worse fate? I never found out. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but I doubt they ever found those guys, Red, Mitch, Silas, and the others. I haven't been back to the Appalachian Mountains since. Some things are best left alone. The morning fog hung low over the dense forest as I, Ethan Hayes, parked my RV in a small, secluded campsite in Oregon. I'd picked this spot for its promise of solitude, a chance to unplug from the chaos of my life back in the city. The towering trees formed a natural canopy, creating this almost magical atmosphere. You could hear the distant sound of a stream and the occasional chirp of birds, adding to the serene vibe. I'm not your typical city boy. I've always felt more at home in the wild. I've had my share of knocks, like everyone else, but being out here, surrounded by nature, that's always been my way of coping. This trip was supposed to be my escape, my chance to recharge. After setting up the RV and getting everything in order, I decided to take a hike. The sun was just beginning to peek through the fog, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and clean, totally different from the polluted city air I was used to. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, before heading down a narrow trail that snaked through the trees. The trail was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just my city-bred paranoia, but the forest felt different, almost like it was holding its breath. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, with its weathered wood and broken windows. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The cabin was empty, except for a few pieces of broken furniture and a thick layer of dust covering everything. I was about to leave when something caught my eye, a set of photographs pinned to the far wall. They were old and faded, but I could make out the faces of several people, all smiling and seemingly happy. But there was something eerie about them, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly left the cabin, deciding it was best not to linger. As I made my way back to the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest's natural sounds, but the unease kept growing. By the time I reached the RV, I was practically running. Back at the campsite, I tried to distract myself by preparing lunch. I set up a small grill and started cooking some burgers. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and I began to relax. As I sat down to eat, I noticed a man standing at the edge of the campsite. He was tall and thin, with scruffy hair and a wild look in his eyes. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound friendly despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Finally he spoke, his voice raspy and uneven. "You shouldn't be here." "Excuse me," I replied, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated. "This place, it's not safe." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's a public campsite, so I think I'm okay. But thanks for the warning." He shook his head, his expression grim. "You don't understand. They come at night. They come for you." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and disappeared into the forest. I sat there, stunned, unsure of what to make of the encounter. The man's words echoed in my mind, but I tried to brush them off, as the ramblings of a crazy person. As the day turned into night, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The forest, which had seemed so inviting in the morning, now felt oppressive and menacing. I decided to lock the RV door and keep the lights on, hoping it would provide some comfort. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud noise outside. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered out the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty campsite. I was about to go back to bed when I heard it again, this time closer. The dragging sound was followed by a low, guttural moan that sent chills down my spine. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in the RV and stepped outside, my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The forest was eerily quiet. As I moved towards the source of the noise, my flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the trees. I reached the edge of the campsite and saw something that made my blood run cold, a trail of blood leading deeper into the forest. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and a sense of duty drove me forward. I followed the trail, my heart pounding louder with each step. The blood trail led to a small clearing, where I found the source of the noise, a body, mutilated and barely recognizable. It was the man who had warned me earlier. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could have done this, and why? I was so engrossed in the gruesome scene that I didn't notice the figure approaching from behind. A sharp pain shot through my head as something hard struck me. I fell to the ground, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before everything went black was a pair of dirty boots standing next to me. When I came to, I was back in the RV. My hands and feet were bound with rough rope. My head throbbed, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I struggled to free myself, but the ropes were too tight. Panic set in as I realized I was completely at the mercy of whoever had attacked me. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You're awake. Good," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We need to have a little chat." I glared at him, trying to muster as much defiance as I could. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" He chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that you stumbled onto something you shouldn't have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained photograph, the same one I had seen in the cabin. "You saw this, didn't you?" I nodded, unsure of where this was going. "These people, they were my family," he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "The Millers. We lived here in peace until a group of hunters came. They killed my wife, my children, and left me for dead. I've been living here ever since, waiting for the right moment to take my revenge." I felt a surge of sympathy for the man, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. "What does that have to do with me?" "You," he said, leaning in closer, "you're the perfect scapegoat. No one will question a city boy who came out here for some peace and quiet and lost his mind." My blood ran cold as I realized what he was planning. He was going to frame me for the murders, make it look like I had gone on a killing spree. I had to find a way out and fast. I glanced around the RV, searching for anything that could help me. My eyes landed on the small fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. "You're insane," I said, trying to keep him distracted. "You think anyone's going to believe that?" He smirked. "They will. When they find your fingerprints all over the place and your blood on the victims." I waited until he turned his back, then lunged for the fire extinguisher. My fingers closed around the handle, and I swung it with all my might. The canister struck the side of his head with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the ground. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the knife from the counter and cut the ropes around my wrists and ankles. My hands were shaking, but I managed to free myself. I quickly checked the man's pulse. He was still alive but unconscious. I knew I had to get out of there before he woke up. I grabbed my keys and ran to the driver's seat, starting the engine. The RV roared to life, and I speeded down the narrow dirt road, not daring to look back. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind raced as I tried to process everything that had happened. I knew I had to report this to the authorities, but I also knew it would be a long and difficult process to clear my name. When I finally reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police station. I told them everything, from the abandoned cabin to the man's attack and his plan to frame me. They were skeptical at first, but when they found the man's cabin and the bodies, they realized I was telling the truth. The investigation took months, but in the end, the evidence cleared me of any wrongdoing. The man, whose name was Caleb, was charged with multiple counts of murder and was sent to prison for the rest of his life. The days started like any other. I'd taken the RV out to Shenandoah National Park, planning to enjoy some solitude in the great outdoors. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and I prided myself on being well prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me. I guess you could say I'm stubborn that way, never backing down from a challenge, always wanting to test my limits. Little did I know this trip would push me further than I ever thought possible. After setting up camp, I decided to go for a hike. The trails were familiar, and I relished the tranquility of the forest, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I'd been walking for about an hour when I spotted a guy ahead, crouching by a creek, apparently struggling to light a fire. "Need a hand?" I called out, trying to be friendly. He looked up startled, then nodded with a forced smile. "Yeah, thanks. I can't seem to get it going." As I approached, I noticed he looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. Something about him seemed off, but I brushed it aside. Maybe he was just another camper who'd had a rough night. "I'm Alex," I introduced myself, extending a hand. "Mike," he replied, shaking my hand with a grip that was a little too tight. "Been out here long?" "Just got here this morning, you." "Couple of days," he said, avoiding eye contact. I helped him get the fire going and shared some of my food. He was jumpy, constantly glancing around, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. But what really set my alarm bells ringing was when he asked, You here alone?" "Yeah," I lied, "but my buddies are joining me later." But his reaction was almost imperceptible, but I caught it, a flicker of disappointment, or perhaps annoyance. My instincts told me to be cautious, so I made an excuse to leave, promising to check on him later. Back at my RV, I couldn't stop thinking about Mike. There was something unsettling about him. I decided to lock the doors and keep my rifle close, just in case. As the sun began to set, the park's serene beauty transformed into an eerie silence. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the RV. My heart raced as I grabbed my rifle and peered out the window. Shadows danced in the moonlight, but I couldn't see anything. Then, another thud, this time louder and closer. I stepped outside, rifle ready, scanning the darkness. "Mike," I called out, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, every rustle of the leaves amplifying my anxiety. I circled the RV, my senses on high alert, but found nothing. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something odd, a pile of fresh dirt near the edge of my camp. Curiosity and dread warred within me as I approached the mound. Using my flashlight, I began to dig, revealing a gruesome sight, a partially buried body, its face frozen in a grimace of terror. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Who was this? And more importantly, where was Mike? I heard footsteps behind me and spun around to find Mike standing there, his expression cold and detached. "You shouldn't have come out here alone, Alex," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Why?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "What the hell is going on?" Mike smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a game," he said simply. "Survival of the fittest." Before I could react, he lunged at me, a knife glinting in the moonlight. We struggled, the knife slicing through my shirt and grazing my skin. I managed to knock him off balance, and we both tumbled to the ground. My rifle was just out of reach, and I knew I had to end this quickly. Mike was on me again, his strength surprising given his wiry frame. I fought back with everything I had, using the survival skills I'd honed over the years. Finally, I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, knocking him unconscious. Panting, I retrieved my rifle and stood over him, contemplating my next move. Leaving him alive wasn't an option. I had seen the body, I knew what he was capable of. As much as I hated the idea, I knew I had to protect myself. I tied him up and secured him in the RV, planning to drive to the nearest ranger station at first light. But as dawn broke and I prepared to leave, Mike began to stir, laughing maniacally. "You think this ends here?" he taunted. "There are more of us. You'll never be safe." Ignoring his threats, I started the engine and drove to the ranger station. They took Mike into custody, and I spent the next few hours recounting my ordeal. The rangers were shocked by the discovery of the body and promised to launch a full investigation. It wasn't until later that I learned the full extent of what I'd stumbled into, a group of thrill seekers who enjoyed hunting humans for sport. Mike was just one of many, and the realization that there could be others out there, watching, waiting, was a chilling thought. After giving my statement, I left the station, exhausted but relieved. The authorities had everything they needed to pursue the rest of Mike's group. I drove back to my campsite to pack up, eager to put this nightmare behind me. As I loaded my gear into the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. Still, the unease lingered, a reminder that some dangers can't be outrun, only faced head-on. I didn't waste time after that. I drove straight home, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. The events of that day would stay with me, a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most serene places. Years later, I still camp, but I'm always prepared, always vigilant. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it's also unforgiving, and sometimes the greatest threats come not from nature, but from man.